So what is cordite? Cordite is a mixture of nitrocellulose, otherwise known as gun cotton, and nitroglycerin. These are made by reacting the organic materials, in the case of gun cotton, obviously cotton, with nitric acid, and in the case of nitroglycerin, glycerin with nitric acid. Both these materials were discovered in the middle of the 19th century when the field of chemistry was expanding extremely rapidly. Both of them are extremely unstable, and nitroglycerin in particular was so unreliable that its manufacture was banned in many countries across Europe. Gradually, production methods improved and were made safer, but in fact neither of these materials on their own was satisfactory as a propellant, since the reaction on ignition was far too violent.
Well, here I am down at the centre of the Royal Naval Cordite Factory, standing near the original building that was built specially here for the production of acetone. Well, why do we need acetone? It's an important solvent, and it is used to allow the mixing of the main ingredients of cordite. This was the cordite used at the beginning of the First World War. The main ingredients were gun cotton, made on the section down that direction, nitroglycerin up in the centre part of the factory, mineral jelly, and all of it had to be mixed together before it could be processed. At the beginning of the First World War, industrialists and university people were asked to supply to the War Office any suggestions that might help the war effort. One of the suggestions that had been made was from Chaim Weizmann. He was at Manchester University, a biochemist, and he had a method of producing butyl alcohol and acetone biologically. Now, he was called by Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, and it is said that he went to the office and said, "Mr. Weizmann, I understand you can produce acetone biologically." He replied, "Yes, sir, but only in very small amounts in a laboratory." Churchill said, "We need 20,000 tons of acetone, or we're going to have to change the process for producing our cordite. Can you scale things up for me? And what facilities do you need?" "Well, I'm going to need the services of a brewery, sir." "Well, take over a brewery and see what you can do." So they took over the brewery of Nicholson's Gin Factory at Bromley. And in about 6 months' time, they'd actually produced batches of about 1/4 of a ton. So returning to Churchill, saying we've at least got large batches being produced, he said, "Right, you can take over breweries for use for that purpose, and I will build you a factory, and one of my munitions factory in Dorset." And here it is, the result of the big decision by Churchill to have an acetone factory at Holton Heath. In this area was the enormous maize granary that supplied the acetone factory. That's the fuel for the whole process. The main railway line is alongside up on the embankment there. But all this was taken down after the plant came out of use in 1934. This whole acetone production plant was built in 1916. On the left here is the cooker house. After the material was cooked in the cooker house, it was sent into these fermentation vats. There were 8 of these vats. They are about 36 foot in diameter. They are hollow from this band of concrete, which is at about 6 foot up. The idea is that you don't get heat transmitted into the ground because it's a warm process in the fermentation. The material goes in through this pipe and upwards into the vessel, The pipe connections above are probably for things like compressed air or hot or cold water to get the temperature right for the fermentation that was going on inside. Once the fermentation is completed, it will be pumped to the distillation house, which was on the far side of these. And there the acetone will be extracted. And the remains of the material, we're not quite sure what happened to it. It may well have been used for feeding pigs. Often this happened in brewing industry. Well, these plants kept going all during the First World War, but at the end of the war the demand for acetone reduced, and eventually the process did change so that there could be a non-solvent system. These fermentation vats were still here at the beginning of the Second World War, and the thought was to use them as refuges or air raid shelters. The top area was filled with soil. We could get in through these doors here, now been bricked up for safety reasons. It wasn't a great height inside, and there was actually writing on the pillars inside saying, "Be careful of your head," because there was not much height in there, but it was better that than not having shelters at all. In the soil at the top grew naturally seeded trees, and you see them now, after all these years, probably 20 or 30 feet high. I guess they must be the biggest flower pots in Dorset. This is the current situation here at the Royal Naval Cordite Factory. This is the area with the administrative buildings and laboratory sections. Here we have the main laboratory, quality control of all the propellant made on the establishment. We're privileged to be able to come through this gate. This fence was put up to divide the main part of the factory from that being used by the Admiralty Materials Laboratory. Seems rather strange to be coming in here, probably the first time since I retired about 17 years ago. Proceeding along the path towards the reservoir, we've passed some air raid shelters which were provided for the people who lived in the main office and laboratories there, and we have a line of macrocarpa trees. Some of those that were planted in 1927, now probably being about 40 feet high. The reservoir was situated on the highest point on the site, Black Hill. It was originally here, and one of the reasons may be why the site was chosen. I've come up here nearly to the top of the service reservoir. Fairly steep steps all the way, but we've made it. This was the main storage of water for the whole factory from the First World War. Just behind the building where the recharging of the electrical batteries were, we have the steam engine shed. One of the more interesting buildings still remaining at in the site here. This is where the 4-foot 8.5 railway engines were for running around the site. There were at least 3 of them we know about, 060 saddle tanks. And they would come here obviously to be serviced and looked after when they were not in use. They would go all the way through the siding and in fact up over the bridge and the overbridge down to Rockley Jetty, which was where the main supply of materials used to go up to about the late 1930s. We're not very far from the bridge, but you can see the embankment coming from the factory along in front of us, now well covered with gorse and all sorts of other trees, which then approaches the bridge, and the line then continues on the embankment on the far side, curving round to be pretty well parallel with the main line for a long way until it gets near to Rockley Jetty itself. And we're here on the bridge across the main line which connects up the factory with Rockley Pier. This is the bridge that was put in. The line from Holton Heath factory to the Rockley Pier had to cross the existing main line. And this is the bridge, the remains of it at least. It's now only a footbridge, but at least you can get over it and walk as far as the pier. The railway embankment here continues to the east, running parallel to the main line, high above the bay. The remains of a partly brick and concrete building could well have been one of the gun emplacements here in World War II. Just near the end of the embankment, we have the remains of one of the buildings. This would have been a mess room and a building where the staff working on the pier could use as a shelter, and also the people driving the trains could come in and use the facilities here. It's now just about collapsed. There's still some of the walls left only. The trains left the factory by the special gates and then proceeded here along the embankment. Best part of half a mile. You can imagine the steam trains coming along here with their loads of cordite. Over the years, the trees have completely overgrown it now, so that its embankment is not visible. I am standing here at what remains of Rockley Pier. This pier, you can only now see a few stakes out into the water, but this is where the standard gauge railway came from the factory. Barges could pull alongside the pier and they could be loaded up with the cordite material, which was then taken to the filling stations. The material was taken in sailing barges. They could be pulled in on the left-hand side of the stakes, which you see out there now. They would be filled up with about 100 tons of cordite. They were towed to Stakes Buoy out in the harbour, and they could be then sailed all the way round to Priddy's Hard, near Gosport, the filling station there, and then onwards to Chatham, to Upnor Castle, yet another filling station. The railway line came through a special gate in the factory fence, It came over the bridge and then all the way along the embankment to here.